what does this meadow mean to you? Does this aquarium screensaver evoke a deep-seated emotion in you? What about this liquid hand soap? If any of these ring a bell, you might just feel a tinge of nostalgia for them, or possibly the aesthetic associated with them. Frutiger Aero, and its various subgenres. But what does an aesthetic that was only coined back in 2017 have to do with phones going from this to this, or these succumbing to these? Well, let's find out. And while we do, I'll be knitting something Frutiger Aero inspired, which could actually make more sense than you might think at first. I'll be using yarns left over from previous projects, because what is nostalgia if not a fabric of memories? The very first colour I'll be using was from a failed project that, until now, never made it to the light of anyone's screen before. And you can see the original project over on my Patreon along with the charts I used for this piece. Thank you to all my patrons past and present, your support has and continues to make this channel possible. For the sake of convenience, I'll be using the term Frutiger Aero to also refer to its subgenres as well as the time period itself, but for the most part, I'll be referring to the aesthetic as just that. Okay, let's get started. For the majority of this project, I decided to work flat, which was actually just a coincidence, or so I thought. It was fitting either way. And as is usually the case, I was going to work from the bottom up, because the grass is always greenest. The term Frutiger Aero was first coined by Sophie Lee of the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute in 2017. The Frutiger half derives from the typeface designer Adrian Frutiger, most known for the Universe, Frutiger, and Avenir fonts. His work was particularly influential in the earlier days of computing, as his designs were notably legible relative to other fonts at the time. In other words, he was a key figure in designing the text we read on screens today. The term Aero stems from Windows Aero, the design language and theme for Windows Vista and subsequently Windows 7. Aero stands for authentic, energetic, reflective, and open. How wonderful. But here's the thing. One of the key motifs of the contemporary Frutiger Aero aesthetic is this meadow wallpaper, which seems to be one of, if not the original bases for the green landscapes in the newer Frutiger Aero imagery. But you may recall that default Windows Vista actually leaned more towards the Aurora Borealis side of things, hence the Aero design language. This meadow, originally titled Bucolic Green Hills, now known as Bliss, was actually the default wallpaper for Windows XP, the previous operating system that launched in 2001, a few years earlier than the period Frutiger Aero supposedly encapsulates. And if you're also hearing David Byrne's Like Humans Do playing in the distance, me too. But of course, it's reasonable and accurate to say that the aesthetic isn't solely limited to what it's named after. Clearly, there is some overlap, but I don't think this is insignificant. On the contrary, I actually think it's rather telling, and sure enough, we'll be getting to the bottom of what it might mean. So, as a key element in the concept and history of the aesthetic, I'm starting this project with a green meadow, a reference to the scene that welcomed many of us into a world of word processing and web games. All of a sudden, solitaire was for losers, though my younger self would have definitely disagreed with that. It's important to note that in addition to Frutiger Aero, the aesthetic is also known as Web 2.0 Gloss, referencing the transition to a more interactive and user-focused online experience, coupled with the glossy textures of the Vista interface. Already, you can see how this aesthetic seeks to define a certain period in our relationship with technology, one that many of us would agree was a pivotal one. No doubt, tech has evolved exponentially since. So much of what we have now, we could only wish for back then. So why are we feeling nostalgic for this? Was the grass really or even literally greener back then? After all, Frutiger Aero was coined years after the fact. Of course, it was only fitting that I wore my Vaporwave versus Synthwave shirt for this. In a 2023 Dazed article by Laura Holiday titled "What is Frutiger Aero? The Aesthetic Taking Over from Y2K?", Amanda Brennan, meme librarian and former head of editorial at Tumblr, said the following: "I think there's a lot of hopefulness in this aesthetic that Y2K doesn't have. I think people are searching for aesthetics and feelings that can help them shake off the last couple of years, something that is still nostalgic and still hitting that comfort bubble, but also a little more out there, a little more exploratory." Following this, Holiday expresses the following: "This hopefulness and return to a more playful and quirky style can be seen not just in us tiring of Y2K nostalgia, but also voicing a general sense of boredom with the flat, minimalist style that dominates much of tech and online interfaces today." With regard to the flatness, I ended up reading this last part quite late in the process of making this video, so this felt pretty validating. I think it's something that many, if not most of us, have been feeling. Of course, all of this will unfold more as we progress. With the ever-looming transition to the mysterious Web 3.0 bobbing up and down the horizon every now and then, it's easy to reminisce about when Web 2.0 was new, fun, and a lot less dystopian than the data-hoarding algorithm maze monster that it's become today. The ever-growing IRL threat of an uninhabitable planet makes the green pastures and blue skies filled with tropical fish feel like a cold, refreshing drink in an impossibly harsh desert. In these senses, the grass really was greener back then, but perhaps, now immortalized within its aestheticdom, Frutiger Aero is actually now at least partly defined by being the greenest. Now, you might be thinking what I'm thinking, because something about this didn't sit well with me. Maybe because it doesn't feel like 2007 was really that long ago? I guess what I mean is, where, or rather when, did the optimism go? Were the eco-centric themes and earthly yet otherworldly wallpapers and screensavers meant to be the promise of a better, technologically advanced future? Or were they only a distraction? A propaganda, even? I'm afraid the emo kids were right all along. Hope is the worst of evils, for it prolongs the torment of man. Call me a horse because I've been blinkered by the dual monitor displays. Yes, this must be the original Google Glass. The Google Grass, because that's what horses eat. Okay. On second thoughts, the design is very human. The bluest skies are ahead. The period of Frutiger Aero was obviously a transformative one, and anecdotally speaking, I would say that it was a really optimistic time when it came to technological advancements, especially for anyone who had a good amount of disposable income. It's helpful to note that the first half of the Frutiger Aero period was before the 2008 crash. This was a period that was defined by the rapid evolution of computers, handheld devices, and consoles, when phones still looked very different to each other. From small bricks, to flip phones, to sliding ones, to sometimes twisting ones. Many had some pretty unique selling points, whether it be their design, or their function as an MP3 player phone, for example. The Sony Ericsson Walkman phones are the only reason I remember that being a big deal. Flip phones and feature phones were, in my opinion, just more interesting, at least visually speaking. Which begs the question, is something automatically less interesting just because it's less advanced? My answer would be no, but as someone who hand knits a lot, you may as well be preaching to the choir. Back then, we hopped back and forth from the Game Boy Advance SP to the PSP, from the PS2 to the Xbox and GameCube, to the Nintendo Wii, followed by the Nintendo DS. And especially compared to consoles nowadays, they felt like they came out at breakneck speeds one after the other, if not all at once. and I don't remember ever feeling like things would ever slow down, though of course they did, eventually. It sounds like stating the obvious, but all these new models and inventions all offered things that genuinely felt innovative in one way or several ways. The Nintendo Wii having wireless controllers wasn't exactly brand new, never-before-seen stuff, but the way it was incorporated and packaged was crazeworthy. For most of us, it may as well have been the first motion-controlled console. From the USB MP3 player to the iPod, my mind was completely blown when I saw the first iPod Nano ad on TV, and I can say that I've never felt the same feeling to the same extent, or more, since. The iPod and its silhouette ad campaigns also appear to have had a role in the story of the Frutiger Aero aesthetic. These colourful and playfully unrelenting waves of new fandangled gadgets were just that. They were fun. Each new model was meant to be better, faster, slicker. To be fair, for the most part, they were. They really seemed like it. And this trajectory was cemented in our minds. The learned lesson being that technology was going to stay on this track, and that the bluest skies were only ahead of us. Head in the clouds. How sweet to be a cloud, floating in the blue. It makes him very proud, to be a little cloud. It's easy to forget that clouds, as sweet and fluffy as they can also be a sign of rain to come. They are emotions that have yet to turn into tears. There's also something to be said about having your heads in the clouds. It's probably how I would describe my favorite part of knitting. The part when you feel like you're on a roll, as clouds often are, and that nothing has or possibly could go wrong. Of course, the bliss of a majestic meadow scene would simply be incomplete without some cute cloudage, so I added some. And the first one turned out quite alright. If anything, it was encouraging. I used a combination of stranded colorwork and intarsia. Admittedly, it was a little awkward, but I also put much of that down to my inexperience with intarsia-heavy projects. To put it simply, I was still a pupil of the Trust No Stitch school of thought, and I was determined to graduate with flying colors. In practical terms, I'll put it this way. By trying not to screw up the tension, I was kind of screwing up the tension. But we'll get to all that in due course. Since we were in some ways spoiled by this boom in consumables that made our lives easier and infinitely more fun, did it kind of push our heads into the clouds when it came to what we thought the future would look like? Because something happened during this post-Y2K era, and it was so shiny and cool that we didn't question the long-term implications of relying on the tech industry for almost every aspect of our lives. And there's a lot more to be said about this, but there's also something else that I feel needs to be mentioned when it comes to the aestheticization of this era over the last few years. By now, we're all more than familiar with the aestheticization of multiple fashion genres, design movements, and subcultures which were popular around 2 decades ago, likely courtesy of the 20-year fashion cycle, also known as the 20-year rule. Examples would be McBling, pop-punk emo, the scene aesthetic, and even the somewhat elusive office siren, which I'm convinced was only a thing in the movies. For the longest time, it's been almost mandatory to view the world 2 decades ago through a cool tinted lens, which is basically saying that each generation of young, fashion-conscious people have done their fair share of romanticizing the past in their own way. Often in a way that's not necessarily all that accurate to the experiences of most people during the time. Aesthetics have been a way for younger generations to join together in appreciation of a look, theme, and often feeling that speaks to them. It always has been. Social media only seems to have sped up the process and made it more widespread. It's been a proven way to find commonality somewhere in the ever-growing fractals of our recommended feeds. However, the reason this is coming up at all while we're on the topic of clouds is that these interpretations of the past, again, are often inaccurate in an objective sense. And so long as the objective truth of wearing dresses with bootcut jeans isn't being erased, I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I think there is a fundamental difference between Frutiger Aero the aesthetic and the lived experience of the period it builds itself upon, the latter being the first-hand experience of a truly transformative time, defined by an insatiable hunger en masse for the latest and greatest tech, before minimalism took over. And the former, as in the aesthetic, being the visual and emotional manifestation of a longing for the time when we were afforded such a privileged mentality. Even if you couldn't afford the latest and greatest, especially if you were a child or a young person at the time, this aspirational lifestyle still didn't seem too far out of reach for the average person. And for some time, it was also still quite common to be in a room full of people who didn't have the same phones as each other. Everyone thinks of the 80s when it comes to unfettered excess and consumer culture, and I would say that this particular era had a similar vibe when it came to new tech. Finally, new gadgets were mainstream, they were marketed towards everyone, no longer mostly niche products for professionals, nerds, professional nerds, or nerdy professionals, or kids with rich parents. Suddenly, even secondary school children had mobile phones, and by this point, most UK households had at least one computer. The possibilities actually felt endless. What were they going to come up with next? The ability to watch The Big Bang Theory on a 2-inch third-generation iPod screen? Maybe this was a fever dream, but I'm convinced I saw this happen in real life. Couldn't be me though, I had a second gen. You'll have noticed that I've covered the tech side of things a lot, and it's not just because of Windows wallpapers and Apple MP3 players. This is an important topic to cover for later on. But for now, the point is that Frutiger Aero doesn't have to be, actually it has no business in being, in air quotes, accurate. But if you're of a certain age, you probably knew that already. Accuracy was always beside the point, but I also feel that it's important to recognize this, to see this aesthetic for what it is and what it can provide, and not that it was the actual vibe or energy that existed back then. Because at the time, Apple and Microsoft were not attending the same school of design, let alone the same extracurricular classes. And what do you know? Nothing has changed. Well, we're not going to get into who may or may not have copied whose homework and when, but you get it. The reason they both work together in one aesthetic is likely more to do with how they were woven into collective memory, the fabric of space-time, like parallel stripes on the same vintage shirt. When I search for Frutiger Aero imagery, I'm mostly met with exaggerated and heavily saturated collages that feel like a fever dream painted by ecofuturism and part-time dolphin girls. As much as it is familiar, it is equally, if not more, inauthentic. Frutiger Aero is only possible in hindsight, and in a way, it was never of the time, but it is of this time, and I think that's more than valid. Personally speaking, I will gladly have my clouds and eat them. Speaking of which, when it came to these knitted clouds, it dawned on me that my head actually was in the clouds, far from grounded in reality.
Okay, so this cloud just isn't working out, and I don't want to continue with things as they are. My assumption is that it only looks this way because it's so small, so all of the tension issues just aren't that clear. But with this larger cloud, the combination of intarsia and stranded color work just doesn't look good.
As we've already learned on this channel, cotton and color work are like the ever-revolving carousel of the interpersonal relationships of a Real Housewives franchise. One season they're best friends, the next they're threatening each other. Occasionally they're in legal trouble, from which there is sometimes no escape. But what remains consistent is the unrelenting cycle of building up and breaking down. At what cost? Time, of course. But somehow, I just can't stop myself from doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Just kidding, this really was going to be different this time around, like it was the last time. Or so help me. The truth is that this specific design worked best as an intarsia-only piece, for several reasons. Number 1, there were purposefully very few color changes per row. Number 2, cotton floats created by carrying one color behind the other can be quite restrictive in cotton, and can still affect the tension if they're too loose. Number 3, the floats also had a habit of showing through at the gauge I was working with, especially with the floats being a darker color. It's also likely nothing would have changed had the gauge been different. Lastly, it was just annoying having to make sure I didn't trap the floats in the same column for consecutive rows, i.e. stack them. So what was the one reason I was willing to ignore and risk all of the above for? The fact that going all in on intarsia meant having to introduce and cope with a separate yarn for each color change. But as much as I couldn't stand the mere idea of it, I gave in. And soon enough, the very thing I dreaded and avoided was becoming the thing I loved the most. It was oddly satisfying, and even somewhat addictive. What's more, to keep the flames alight, I had to modify the clouds to be more intarsia friendly. This was to avoid having to switch to stranded colorwork halfway up each cloud, or worse yet, incorporate more sources of yarn. I have finally completed the first set of clouds, and I think you can really tell the difference between them. So as you can see, the first cloud is a little funny looking. I think it's quite cute, so I decided to leave it, even though it doesn't quite match the other two. The intarsia alone is definitely neater than the combination of the two. Obviously the trade-off is that you do have to end up using more balls or sources of yarn, which is a little annoying, and honestly the tangles weren't great, but they also weren't that bad, so I can't complain too much. But now we have to move on to the next part, which, given that I assumed that I would still be doing the stranded colorwork by now, I am a little apprehensive about how complicated it's going to be. It's not going to be too bad, it's just not what I expected, and let's just say there probably will be some duplicate stitching involved later. It's not to say that it's impossible without, but I do think it will make my life a lot easier, so let's just get started. I'm also excited, so I don't want it to sound like I'm dreading it completely. It is, we'll just see. Yeah. Aren't you glad they didn't lime to us? I couldn't help myself with that one. To sort of capture the bright, colourful optimism that this era advertised to us, I wanted this top to be fun in some way. And during my initial research for Frutiger Aero visuals, I noticed how common citrus fruits were. Now this does feel familiar, but it wasn't easy to pinpoint specific examples. All that came to mind were Kristen Krug's Neutrogena ads, which apparently didn't contain any oranges despite the orange-coded visuals, the network company named Orange, and perhaps the most relevant, Boost juice bars. Of course, I don't consider myself to be anything close to an authority on what qualifies as Frutiger Aero and its subgenres, but I'd say the first one gives an orange vibe, the second is just literally called orange, and the last one was somewhat Frutiger Aero-ish in design, bar the logo font itself, and actually appears to have had the kind of orange imagery that seems in keeping with the 2000s style. Anyway, I wanted to incorporate oranges somewhere in this piece, as not only a bright addition to an otherwise calm colour scheme, but to also add a little surrealism. Again, like fish in the sky. Because even though anything is possible in our imaginations, everything is possible so long as it can be viewed through a screen, or on any flat surface for that matter. Is it still a coincidence that I'm knitting this flat? We're already kind of getting the idea that the era in question seems to be the beginning of a highly questionable promise of a utopian tech future. The bait and switch, if you will. Before the blue-skied meadows and juicy dancing fruits, technology simply looked a little more function over fashion, or at best, a compromise between the two. There was still a limit to how small things could be, and hardware in shades of beige were the original shapewear. Eventually, computers and their accessories started to come in other colors too, such as grey, black, and a very faux metallic silver. But let's not fail to credit the infinitely more fashionable 1998 Apple iMac G3 and subsequent matching iBooks, the precursors to the MacBooks we use today. I think this is what people remember most from this time in terms of tech that actually looked good, rather than just nostalgic. It certainly seems like one of the key moments in shifting our perspectives of what tech could look like. In other words, what our tech-filled and fueled futures could look like. Now, I'm no expert, and I think that's apparent, so if you have any examples of visually innovative tech that you think may have contributed to this shift, feel free to share them with us in the comments. The big orange elephant in the room is, of course, that even though our offices and living rooms were constantly updating with all these new iterations of interactive furniture, so to speak, the rest of our lives were barely catching up, if at all. The closest thing in comparison was likely our wardrobes, since fast fashion was also on the rise as it had been since the 80s, but that was truly on another level. Basically, most of us weren't redecorating our entire homes to match each new addition. All of this is to say that our immediate physical realities likely didn't look anything like the worlds portrayed behind our computer or even television screens. Most of us weren't constantly surrounded by shiny skyscrapers, fresh tropical fruits, or fish, or even blue skies and fields of green, and definitely not all at once. Unless you were like, super special, or something. But regardless, you could always rely on your desktop or laptop to be the window into a world that was all of this, and more. And that just wasn't a thing before. It certainly makes even more sense that they called it Microsoft Windows. Not that fun a fact, the operating system was named after windowing software. Not this dystopian, utopian malarkey. I can only hope. The daily dose of desktop wallpaper may as well have been subliminal messaging. Isn't life so much brighter and greener when you live in the virtual world? Not only did we have The Sims, there was also Second Life, IMVU, and a multitude of MMORPGs. While we were polluting the oceans to the point where the Finding Nemo DVD special features had Jean-Michel Cousteau lecturing us about the dying coral reefs, the seascapes of our screensavers weren't just healthy and vibrant, they were immortal, and the fish were doing just fine. They just kept swimming. I miss the stitch. If palm olive wasn't Pavloving you into believing that you were literally cleaning the oceans every time you washed your hands, or at the very least that the oceans were so clean that they actually smelled of artificially fragrant soap, then marketing is a fool's game. The eco-fying of objects and products in our everyday lives was perhaps more significant than I ever thought of it being back then. I just remember how colourful it was. But maybe I'm just remembering the adverts and supermarket shelves, which would only further my point. It was a respite from an otherwise grey and dreary climate, in several senses of the word, albeit a contrived one. Even at a young age, I can remember feeling a faint discomfort at how much this utopian vision of a green, technologically advanced future contrasted so obnoxiously with the much less vibrant atmospheres of British towns and shopping centres, at least for what seemed to be the majority of the year. None of it came close to complementing the existing landscapes and architecture around us. So when and how was all this futuristic stuff going to take over? The countryside was the closest you could get, but it was still far too rustic for the engineered vision that Frutiger Aero ultimately aims to emulate. I don't know, maybe this was the beginning of the cognitive dissonance. Tech was improving our lives at an increasingly accessible rate, but at the same time, Web 2.0 was also removing us more and more from our immediate, material lives. Sure, we were living in this reality, but we were really starting to live online. My first job was running a shop on Neopets, and social media platforms were quickly gaining traction. So to bring this all back to the aesthetic at hand, I think Frutiger Aero conveys a certain sweet spot in a sense, a time of new and exciting discovery, of exploring another life outside of the one we were born into. The two hadn't yet been flattened into one, which meant we still had a freedom to roam. These years were the first euphoric spoonfuls of ice cream before the tummy ache, the sugar crash, or even the brain freeze, as we reached closer and closer to the bottom of the gallon. I wasn't going to leave things here, and I did plan on adding the detailing in white, but doing so meant duplicate stitching, since it wasn't going to be intarsia friendly. So I decided to move on. The duplicate stitching would simply have to wait until after the wet blocking. Green thumbs on the button. For the back panel, I wanted to make it a continuation of the front panel when it came to the meadow. I wanted things to come full circle, which with the right seaming could make the top itself look like an infinitely rolling hill, as long as I can commit to spinning around for all of eternity. But I feel like the planet is already doing a pretty good job of it. Anyway, this meant mirroring the color work so the colors would all join at exactly the right points. Okay, I think it's about time I address the most tangible aspect of all of this. Why is everything literally flat now, when, as evidenced earlier, it never had to be? Because judging by the shared nostalgia for iconic discontinued phone models, and the return and evolution of the mechanical keyboard, we're clearly no longer that into the aesthetic of a lost and lonely metro tile. And yet everything, hyperbolically speaking, looks the same now. Everything looks like various shapes and sizes of kitchen tiles. Don't get me wrong, a lot of tech has always looked similar across different makes and brands, but this made sense back in the day when innovation was still relatively limited. My point is, that's clearly not the issue anymore. It makes me wonder, did the excitement and variety of Frutiger Aero back then prime us for the sterile tech era we now find ourselves in? Were we so spoiled by the possibilities afforded to us that we got sick of the endless choices, forcing most of the less popular models out of fashion and manufacture, paving the way for minimalism to put us in its chokehold? Did we walk right into it? Or is it simply that tech companies min-maxed their designs so much that Apple's slowly disappearing bevel became peak innovation? I guess if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. R.I.P. to the BlackBerry. No doubt, a lot of knowledge is now lost due to technological obsolescence, so even if we wanted to bring back, say, the Nokia 7600, or the ability to send messages via Excel, there's a chance it may not even be possible, realistically speaking. Only now that we realize how much we may have taken for granted, do we yearn for what Frutiger Aero reminds us of. The freedom and ability to choose the things that no longer exist. I mean, saying it sounds greedy, but this expression of nostalgia kind of is just that. wanting something you already had on top of what you currently have. But equally, for some of us, it's wanting something we never had, and that's different. Most of us might not be willing to give up TikTok, Netflix, and Spotify for MySpace, early YouTube, and the local music store. But a fair number of people actually might, and you might be one of them. I'm starting to believe I might be one of them. If you're thinking it's really not that deep, I would argue that it literally is that deep. Before we get to that, however, let's get into what exactly is happening with this back panel. No ifs or butterflies. Clearly, uploading our lives to the cloud over the last decade or so might not have been the best idea in hindsight. I don't even know if that's worth getting, but hindsight, behind, working on the back panel, while looking back in time? Anyway, this time I didn't want to include any clouds. I felt like things needed to be different. They had to be. So in order for clouds to disappear, wind needs to blow. And what's one letter away from wind? Wing, of course, because I'm sure this is how the English language works. And a creature that has wings is the butterfly. Not just any butterfly, not even the monarch butterflies that you'll find every now and then in Frutiger Aero visuals, but this blue morpho butterfly, which, if memory serves me right, might have actually been my Windows XP user profile back in the day. And I feel like somewhere, somehow, my younger self is actually excited about this. I decided to stick to using the white yarn again since I wanted it to work with the front panel. Truthfully, I'm also not sure what other colour would have worked just as well, if not better. A white butterfly against a blue sky. Why does that seem so familiar? Hang on a minute. Is this the butterfly effect? This was honestly just a coincidence, but maybe it was meant to be. So again, why is it that deep? Why is the widespread trend towards flattening everything such a big deal? Unlike the keys of a modern MacBook, it's not as shallow as it sounds. I've been listening to a lot of 70s and 80s music lately, and my feed has started to show me a bunch of cool and somewhat unusual record, cassette, and most interestingly for me, CD players with unique designs and mechanisms. And it made me realize that Frutiger Aero also, and perhaps inadvertently, symbolizes the soon-to-be demise of these very tactile and tangible technologies. Skeuomorphism is a term you'll see used to describe the aesthetic quite often, mostly when it comes to the glossy, glass, and water-like textures in the Windows Aero design language, evoking a light, natural, and elemental feel. It's essentially when things are designed to reference other things, the reason often being to make them easier to understand, recognize, or just appreciate. Other examples would be the old Apple YouTube icon of a vintage TV, as well as the first Instagram logo, which was a Polaroid camera, though technically it is still meant to be one. Although these examples fit within the definitions and timeline of the aesthetic, they were very much, if not more so, hipster and twee adjacent. But basically, what used to be familiar three-dimensional objects are now only familiar as two-dimensional references. Long story short, art imitates life, or rather, design imitates older design, though that doesn't sound as good. Another closely related example of how technology has attempted to substitute for or even replace our relationship with the physical world around us is haptic feedback. This is where artificial sensations simulate the interactions we would ordinarily have with the physical world around us. Examples would be phone vibrations in place of door knocks and letters through the post box, but particularly vibrations of typing on a touchscreen instead of keyboard or typewriter, if we're going old school. I mean, imagine knitting or crocheting on an app that makes noises and vibrations while you tap the right things to purl or single crochet. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced this will become a thing, if it isn't one already. Basically, haptic feedback helps us to compensate for and even ignore the fact that we're tapping on an expensive slab of glass, plastic, and metal. In the grand scheme of things, it's quite an unhinged look. The significance of all this is that slowly but surely, though quite rapidly in the wider history of things, this transition away from the analog and mechanical to the digital and electrical has literally and figuratively flattened the way we experience and interact with the world and each other. I miss my CD player alarm clock that would play my Bon Iver CD first thing in the morning as my alarm. The mechanical clicks and soft whirring of the disc were oddly comforting on cold and crisp winter mornings. And yes, listening to good winter made my winter good. But this memory was the last of my memories of playing CDs. Sure, the term my playlist will escape my mouth every now and then when talking about music. But it doesn't feel the same as saying my CD. One triggers the memory of physically procuring it in all its contextual glory, whereas the other has fallen into the blur of my day-to-day screen time. Is this a bad thing altogether? It depends. For the amount of information, convenience, and connection that we now have access to compared to before, you could argue that there's a price to pay for everything. You could also argue that we were perfectly fine without it, though some extra mental gymnastics might be called for with this one. But in some instances, this shift has provided levels of accessibility that just weren't possible before. And why argue against that? It seems silly, but flat screens have never felt the same to me as the CRT televisions that came before. Sure, technology just evolved to take up less space, which was obviously a good thing. But it also meant that my crocodile-brained imagination couldn't keep pretending that there was really a whole other world behind that screen, confined inside that box. Baby Got Back meant so much more underneath the surface. I wonder what Sir Mix-a-Lot has to say about it all. Entertainment stopped taking up space in our space, and instead became windows to other dimensions. And in a way, the larger the screens, the less of our own lives we saw. I'm kind of glad comically large TV screens don't seem to be as trendy as they once were. I distinctly remember how people used to boast about how huge their new television was, and I always wondered if there was ever going to be a big enough. Surely after a certain point, it just wouldn't make a difference anymore. Back in the day, I know I would have taken this Disney Princess TV set over the biggest and flattest TV any day. As you've definitely noticed by now, I decided to go with a different aspect ratio for this video, and it's probably made you feel at least some kind of way. It's comforting and nostalgic for many of us, especially if you're viewing this on a desktop browser, but at the same time it's outdated, and clearly an incomplete use of a very intentionally designed space, optimized for a wider aspect ratio. Obviously this choice is chronologically appropriate for the topic. The camera I used to record with is from the same era that Frutiger Aero is meant to convey. So that's enough reason in and of itself, I guess. But I yearn for meaning. We all do. There was a time when YouTube was designed for this, despite square monitors and laptop screens being on their way out. It was a weird teenage phase in the world of the internet. It was a weird teenage phase for technology in general. The transition from analog to digital, though the music industry had already done it decades earlier. You'll likely have been alive and even remember when television broadcasting made the transition in 2009, or as I remembered it, the UK's digital switchover, a couple years prior in 2007. The same year the first iPhone was announced and released, and Windows Vista took over from our beloved XP. To be honest, I may never have gotten over it. None of these landmark moments really meant much to me at the time. They seemed a lot less significant than they arguably were. We were already used to so much change. Technological advancements were just happening everywhere, all the time, and it felt like the new normal. Again, like things would be this way forever. But looking back, I realized that this was the beginning of the world as we know it today. And not just because that's literally how time works, but because these shifts in direction were permanent. There really was no going back from here. It was the point of no return. And this has made me think of my much younger self, who would visit the YouTube website and play Outkast's Hey Ya Charlie Brown style on repeat. There really wasn't much else on at the time. This was back when YouTube was still an emerging website, and of course I was completely unaware that decades later, I'd be making my own videos and sharing them with you from the very same address. And even though it's only a superficial imitation, making this video in a 4:3 aspect ratio makes it all feel especially full circle. But at the same time, I've also felt a strangeness about the dimensions and low fidelity that I'm no longer used to, the very same that used to be the norm. And yet, there's still a part of me that wants to keep things this way, to reject what has become in favor of what once was, even though it'll never be again. As Andre 3000 asked, why are we so in denial when we know we're not happy here? I guess I'll just get on the floor, then I'll know what to do. The girls that get it, got it. I have still found myself watching all of this footage back more intently than usual. The noise, which has probably worsened as the camera's aged, carries a certain warmth to it. And if there's anything we as knitters and crocheters know about, it's the importance of warmth in what we make and how it feels. The pixels may as well be stitches, and my stitches may as well be pixels. In every way I can think of it, this is all true. This is a colorwork project at the end of the day. The rows of my work are the progressive scan lines that make the image whole. This is what the butterfly symbolizes, the metamorphosis from the flat 2D visuals of Frutiger Aero into a 3D wearable garment. In a very removed and literal sense, it's a way for me to experience the 2D in 3D again. Now, you could make the point that the flattening of our experiences and consumption is just a phase in the history of technological development, and it's not going to last forever. Again, mechanical keyboards have made a triumphant comeback from the disappointingly unresponsive membrane nonsense. I'm being hyperbolic, they're not all that bad, but you know what I'm saying. Back to the point, I can't really see things being this way forever either. But for now, flatness still seems to be the standard, if not the trajectory, even when it's being sold as the total opposite. As immersive and technically 3D as virtual reality is, we still only experience it through lenses snapped rather clumsily onto our faces. Augmented reality, still for the most part, requires flat screens and/or surfaces. And if we're going to take it even further, because drama in and of itself is a spice of life, the more accessible the outside is while remaining inside, the more our homes shrink due to the absolute real estate of affairs, the more two-dimensional our existence becomes, in both the abstract and physical senses. I did say it was going to be dramatic. But I say this because all this talk of flattening reminded me of Irvin Verm's Narrow House, an autobiographical piece exploring his experience of growing up in a suburb under the social constraints and narrow-mindedness of a post-war Austria. The house provides a visually welcoming interior, yet physically disabling space, a place that looks like home, but feels like the complete opposite. As much as it may look like a place to belong, it proves to be anything but. It's somewhere you can barely breathe. But from the right side, the wide side, everything looks normal. And outside of the original meaning and context of the narrow house, I feel like this feeling is comparable to our experience of contemporary media through wide screens. The normalization of viewing the lives of people we don't know and who don't know us. The people who share some of the most intimate aspects of their lives with us, the insides of their homes. It's usually a given that strangers generally don't belong in the homes of strangers, and yet we can all find ourselves as inadvertent, intentional, or even indignant nosy Parkers as the audience of a vlog, courtesy of late-stage Web 2.0. Just like the narrow house, homes on social media look familiar to us, but they are both, in reality, actually flat, and at no point was there ever meant to be any room for us. But what's more, stumbling onto the odd episode of whatever property show has been on over the years, it seems that the narrow house is evidence that life also imitates art. Everything is being flattened. Frutiger Aero, like much of fashion itself, is reactive. The aesthetic calls back to a time before the world flattened from the tangible 3D to the tappable 2D touchscreen. In truth, Frutiger Aero didn't exist so much in our physical realities as the virtual worlds we grew to inhabit. The only way to get there was through a screen, a window, into a window browser. The aesthetics of the aesthetic are of a key point in the transition period, before displays and button dial pads became glass panes, before CD and photo albums evaporated into the cloud. Blame the heat from the fire tunes if you must. I'll always remember the early years of Web 2.0. As much as I remember always wishing things were better and faster back then, there's no denying that I miss the days when all I wanted was to surf the web before rewatching DVDs all afternoon. These were not unique experiences, nor is this feeling unique. The collective yearning is surely a sign of something greater. That, or as imperfect beings, we will always find fault, no matter when or where we are, doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Both can be true at the same time. But in a world that never ceases to change in all the same old ways, I find hand knitting and crochet to be a great way to, if only momentarily, opt out of the breakneck speeds of a modern, post-industrial existence. Though methods and techniques have evolved over the thousands of years that people have used string to make things by hand, we still share the same corporal limitations as all who came before us. Because some things never change. Anyway, I really like how this top turned out in the end, and even though it's admittedly a little tongue-in-cheek, it does remind me of the very time that inspired it. If you too like clouds, oranges, and butterflies, you can find the charts for them down below. Thank you so much for watching.